Great. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate the introduction and welcome to everyone. Glad to be here with each of you today. So just a quick note of introduction and then we'll get into the meat of the content. So I am one of the co-founders here at Topia, based in our London office, though as we live in the world of mobility, and you can tell from my accent, I'm from the US originally, but started my own temporary mobility journey 12 years ago and have never made it back to the US since. These days, I spend my time as the GM of our European business and am excited to spend some time today with each of you. And really, the goal of today and the question that may be on your minds is why are we spending time talking about ROI and business cases when we live in a world of mobility and spend our days in sort of the world of HR. And really, the conversation we've seen is starting to shift. So you put together this increased demand for global mobility, and that might be an increase in demand due to individuals wanting to move more, business demand to get employees around the world, or a broadening definition of mobility to include things like business travel. All of those combined to more mobility in the coming days, weeks, and years. However, you combine that challenge with a continued and relentless focus on cost reduction. So it is top of the CFO's agenda, often top of the CEO's agenda. Everyone is wondering how we can reduce costs in economic times of uncertainty. And those two together seem like a pretty strong contrast and really pull mobility teams in opposite directions. And that's why the conversations around investing in technology for mobility really require a much more analytical approach, an approach that finance professionals are used to living every day, but many folks within mobility and HR may not be used to. So the goal of the conversation today is to bring to life some best practice approaches, recommendations, and learnings for helping organizations build that business case for change. So I touched on briefly, but to dig in a little bit deeper around the demand for increasing global mobility, we did some research last year and found that over 70% of employees saw mobility as a benefit to their career, even without a raise or promotion. And this really has been a generational shift where there is a willingness and in many cases an expectation that mobility will factor in to an employee's career with any given organization. And people are willing to move around the world, sometimes location unseen, for a perceived benefit of career development, even without a change in title or a change in pay even. Additionally, 90% of the HR leaders that we surveyed agreed that mobility helps drive growth, diversity, inclusion, and organizational agility. So a real alignment for mobility, unlocking the overall talent strategy and aligning with key objectives across the organization. And finally, from a Deloitte study, their Human Capital Trends survey, back I think it was the 2017 edition, that 83% of companies expected to have an open or highly flexible career model within the next 3 to 5 years. And time again, as I'm out there talking with CHROs and heads of mobility, there's a real conversation happening around what role mobility needs to play in supporting these new and dynamic career models and how mobility can help attract and develop and retain that top talent. So you have a lot of these tailwinds driving that increase in need and desire for mobility across organizations. And then you pair that with this continued focus on cost reduction. So Gartner runs a pretty interesting annual CEO survey, the latest that came out earlier this year. And unsurprisingly, cost control and improving productivity remain top priorities for CEOs around the world. That's unlikely to change anytime soon, and the challenge back to the organization that I see on a regular basis is great, interesting that you want to invest in some technology. How is it going to help drive productivity improvements, and how is it help helping reduce cost across the organization. From the survey research we did, the sort of opposite side to the understanding and agreement that mobility helped deliver against key strategic objectives was that half of leaders and organizations were blocked from expanding mobility due to cost constraints. And the interesting thing there, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about it today, is it's often a fairly lopsided conversation where cost is perceived purely as the cost of the physical mobility or the assignment compensation package, but oftentimes we're leaving out that return on investment, retention, employee engagement, or frankly the commercial results that a business can drive from having key staff in the right locations on time and on budget. And it's really, I think, that holistic picture, which we'll try and spend the rest of today's webinar on helping share some examples of how to articulate those benefits, how to find some of the numbers behind them to tell a compelling financial story. And I think it's this really shift in mindset that's required and sometimes shift in skill set as well for HR and mobility teams to build this case for investment. And really it's that HR needs to be thinking about telling a different kind of story, one that while it must continue to focus on employee experience and engagement, it also needs to be a much more metrics-driven conversation to help build that case for change and that case for investment in technology. So while there are dozens of potential different areas and components that could inform a business case, we see 4 really common elements that should form that foundation. So the first is around direct replacement costs, and we'll spend some time going through each of these in turn. The second is around efficiency gains. The third piece of the puzzle is around improving employee engagement. And then the fourth, and often forgotten but of critical importance, is alignment of the business case with overarching company strategy. So to bring those to life, share some examples and best practices around each of them, I'll get started with the direct replacement costs. So when I say direct replacement costs, what I'm really talking about here is money that's being spent today on technology or services in many cases that are being used by the mobility team, that with an investment in a new technology solution, that spend would go away. So this is if we invest in technology, we don't have to spend these euros somewhere else. So the first piece of that puzzle is around the most common types of technology costs. So in many organizations, particularly larger programs, there may be custom-built tools that have been built over the years, sometimes on Access databases, sometimes bolt-on to SAP or otherwise. Oftentimes there may be now outdated assignment management tools or other sort of niche point solutions that are solving one small portion of the assignee or relocation lifecycle. The third piece of a common technology cost that we often run across is software licenses. So you'll see mobility teams operating in SharePoint or Salesforce or another sort of legacy tool not built for mobility but used over the years in support of it. And I think one piece to make sure you don't remember as you're building your business, don't forget about when you're building your business case, is thinking about the ongoing costs beyond just the technology license. So there may be ongoing maintenance costs, or upgrade costs that happen once every few years, or configuration costs that aren't part of the formal contractual agreement you may have in place with a vendor, but are happening whenever you need to make a change or an update. Sometimes those costs are direct costs paid to a third party. Other times those costs are borne by other functions within your business. It could be IT or finance or security. So I think it's important to make sure you're sort of thinking about that holistically and digging to identify those areas of spend. Beyond the technology costs, there then are a number of common service costs that we see going away or being significantly reduced with the implementation of new technology. It may be things like transactional cost estimate fees or balance sheet fees. So a pay per calculation approach that is very common with outsourced service providers. There may be payroll calculation fees, which may happen on an annual basis or per pay period basis. Compensation collection fees as well, data cleaning fees, reporting fees. I'll often recommend that as an organization is building a business case, you collect invoice data for the last 2 years for your top vendors, either technology or services, and really go through them in a fair bit of detail to identify pockets of investment and historical spend that would be replaced or unnecessary with the implementation of a new technology. There's a surprising amount of money often sitting out there because it's not sort of a line item within a contract that gets missed, but actually really adds to a compelling ROI investment story for technology. And I think importantly, and a top tip that we always recommend is these fees may oftentimes be hidden in as part of other charges or not broken out as items themselves. So remember a recent example where an organization was saying, oh, well, we're not paying our third party for cost estimates. However, when they went back to the provider and said, hey, one of the things we're looking to do is move away from offline calculations and move our cost estimates into technology, what would our overall annual service fees look like if we didn't have you doing our offline cost estimates? And they found that they were able to achieve some significant savings, even though it hadn't been called out specifically as a line item within an agreement. So keep digging, I think, is the best practice recommendation here. And one example, just to bring this to life, this is a real life example for an organization I was speaking with last year. We started the conversation off and they came to us and said, hey, look, we really are excited about investing in technology for our global mobility management. We don't have any budget, but we're trying to build a compelling business case and story for change. So we started as we generally do, of understanding where you're spending money today, and in response to that initial question, the answer came back, well, we actually don't have any technology that we're paying for today, so there's no money to be saved there. And it wasn't actually until a few weeks later, as we were having a conversation on a slightly separate subject, that a light bulb went off for one of the folks on the team, and it came out, oh, well, actually, but we do use Salesforce for key workflows. Does that count as technology? And as we then sort of had conversations with IT and finance and went around the business, we identified, in this case, 75,000 pounds of license costs that would go away if they moved away from their custom version of Salesforce for mobility. And on top of that, an additional 75,000 pounds a year in maintenance and configuration costs because they were continually refining workflows, changing approvers, and a host of other things. And so it was really telling where we went from we don't spend any money on technology to actually we've identified 150,000 pounds of budget that could be applied as an investment to new technology without having to go back to the business and ask for more money. So it's often a surprising find of money that's sitting out there that's being spent today, and it really is about asking around it from a few different areas, involving finance teams, IT teams, and others in the conversation. Helping take them on that journey can often uncover areas to reduce spend on with technology and therefore build a stronger business case for change. The second piece of the puzzle is around efficiency gains. So this is really around time saved by eliminating manual work through automation of technology. And there's a handful of very common areas, and you'll notice a little bit of overlap between the first bucket of direct costs. For some organizations, things are fully outsourced. For others, they're doing them manually in-house. And even in a world where they're outsourced, we'll often find people spending 10, 15, 20 minutes on a cost estimate alone just to collect the data to send to an outsourced provider. So even in that world of outsourcing, there's still time being spent by the team internally. And the most common areas, the things that crop up time and time again as we help organizations build this case for change, are cost estimates, document creation, balance sheets, payroll, reporting, email traffic to initiate vendors, and the sort of list goes on. The easiest way around this is to go and talk directly to the mobility teams, the payroll teams, and finance that say, hey, what's taking up most of your time today? And you'll find pretty quickly you can identify big areas of time savings. And important within all of this is to think about it from a couple of different lenses. So first, the day-to-day things, which is the sort of top part of that list, but don't forget the things that don't happen day in and day out, right? So I was talking with an organization recently who spends the first 6 weeks of every fiscal year just gathering data on the prior fiscal year, cleaning it, getting it together so they can figure out how much money they spent. And so that was 6 weeks of effort that with technology go down to the click of a button as the data is feeding through real time. And that touches data gathering, data cleaning, and a whole host of other things. And just to give a feel for the size of the impact of technology on driving overall efficiency, here's again another real life example of a program with 500 new moves a year. And when they really dug into what technology meant for them, it was going to be eliminating 10,000 manual emails. There were 20 weeks spent by one person over the course of the year manually building, updating, and refining cost estimates. There was over a month of effort manually cleaning data. And when you look at that capacity and what it would cost to buy that amount of capacity back into the business, easily ranging between 100,000 and £250,000 and on upwards for larger programs in capacity given back to the business. And so this is productive time that could be spent counseling more, supporting more, or scaling the mobility program in growth mode without having to add to the team because you've freed up that capacity. So that impact will vary by organization, but again, there is a lot of time at stake here, and a lot of time being spent doing manual activities, even in a world where there's a few point solutions out there, we find. That third piece of that business case for change is around improving employee engagement. So from a Gartner study, companies in the top quartile of engagement realized 10% higher customer metrics, satisfaction or otherwise, 17% higher productivity, 20% higher sales, and 21% higher profitability than those with less employee engagement. So a very clear indicator, I think, of all what we sort of know in our gut, that if you have teams across your business that are highly engaged in driving outcomes, you're going to have better results. And if your team is distracted, feels unsupported, or disengaged, the business will suffer and suffer significantly over the long run. So what does mobility management technology mean for the employee engagement? So I think there are 4 key buckets here, and again, the prioritization of these will differ by organization. But on one hand, simplifying the relocation process. So this can mean how much time and energy is an employee spending today, hours of time they could be doing active work for their day job, is spent preparing for and executing their own sort of mobility experience. That's real productive time back to the business, and it leaves the employee with a bit of a sour taste in their mouth if they're having to do too much on their own. There's a real opportunity for mobility technology to help streamline onboarding. Sometimes that's sharing information between home and host systems. Sometimes that's taking data that's in PDFs and emails and getting it into a platform. But ultimately, there can be a smoother experience for the individual. I think there's a key piece here around avoiding the experience gap between accepting an offer and starting in your new location. And that may be for an international new hire, it may be for someone going on assignment. But I think one of the things we often see is organizations investing heavily in a recruiting process. Whether that's recruiting technology, whether that's the number of interviews that somebody's going through, there is a real investment in selling the company, selling the brand, and giving it delightful recruiting experience to get someone to accept a position. Organizations are also spending a ton on employee onboarding. So once you've hit day one, and sometimes even a day or two before, what is that experience for that individual to get them connected to the organization and connected to their team, up and running productively? And what we find when you look at the mobility experience for existing employees or new hires, there's often this experience gap from I've accepted my offer time starting on day one, where you move away from technology, you move offline, and you move to a pretty manual, stressful process. And there's a real opportunity for mobility technology to step in and help tackle that experience. And then finally, and critically for everyone in the mobility space, avoiding those sort of post-assignment blues and any resulting departure of key staff. So if, one of the things we'll often recommend is looking at very simple analysis, 12 months post-assignment, or 12 months post-permanent transfer, what's the retention rate of those individuals versus the rest of your population? And you can see very quickly whether you have a challenge or an opportunity. One of the things around engagement is we recommend look at what existing tools are in use across your business around employee engagement already, and see where you can piggyback on those to understand employee satisfaction and engagement over the course of a relocation or the course of an assignment. Now, sometimes this gets a little tricky as home and host locations may have different survey tools or methods for tracking employee engagement. But if an organization has invested heavily in a tool like Culture Amp, which is a tool we use at Topia for employee health check and employee engagement, using that with a mobility lens can be a powerful way to get data and visibility without having to purchase a new tool. And I think we see time and time again, delivering a better mobility experience improves employee retention, without a doubt. I've yet to have anyone challenge that fact. I think interestingly, when you start to put numbers behind this, for this 500 move program, this example I used a bit earlier, just a 10% improvement in retention can deliver a savings of over 700,000 pounds a year back to the business due to lost productivity, recruiting costs, and more. So this is an interesting one where oftentimes people don't have the data or go make a compelling enough case back to the business. But this sort of change, particularly where you have an employee retention problem on the backs of mobility, can be the entire business case in and of itself in some cases. And then fourth is real alignment with company strategy. So one of the common pitfalls that I see is a compelling business case where the financials stack up, but it doesn't tie to something on the CEO or the CHRO's agenda, and therefore it doesn't get prioritized. So if the CEO agenda item is operational efficiency across the business, it's important to talk about how mobility technology can improve efficiency of the mobility team and the organization by 10 to 20% in many cases. If the CEO is talking about cost savings, talk about how technology can give access to a 360-degree view of your mobility spend and help drive savings on not just the technology piece, but importantly, the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds spent a year on mobility. 60% plus of organizations I talk to these days have a real employee experience or a digitization initiative on the CEO's agenda, and mobility can help move the needle on that. We talked a little bit about employee engagement and retention, which is critical. And then finally, increasing agility, that speed of decision-making, that speed of support, and supporting this increased focus on fluid teams is another angle of company strategy that mobility technology can help tie to and really weave in a story that ties back to that company strategic objectives. So quickly to recap here, 4 key elements which we recommend should form the foundations of any business case: that direct replacement cost, there's efficiency gains, that improved employee engagement, and that alignment with company strategy. And to bring that to life, a real life example of an organization we're working with to build this case for change. In their case, they were doing 2,000 outsourced cost estimate transactions a year. That was $2.2 million in direct savings. Now, you may be doing only 200 cost estimates a year, but there's still hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially at stake in terms of savings. There is risk reduction because of missing deferred compensation within your cost estimates. There is operational efficiency that your team is spending even 15 minutes per cost estimate. That adds up quickly. And there's a real impact on agility for this organization. Each year, people around their business were spending 70 to 100 days waiting to get results for cost estimates, and that time goes away. So more than happy to share examples of some of the powerful business cases that we've helped organizations build, but I know we're closing in on time, so I will sort of wrap there and Sean, open it up to any questions we have if we have any time.
Great, thanks, Steve. And just a reminder, if anyone does have a question, now is a great time to submit it. We have had a couple come in, so we'll go ahead and field those. And if by chance we can't get to your questions or you have something you'd rather ask offline, you can always email us as well, and we'd be happy to answer those for you. So, Steve, the first question that we have is, who are the key stakeholders you need to involve in building a business case, and how do you get started?
That's a great question, Sean. I think the key thing for me there is recognizing that this is not a time to try and go it alone. The more people you involve, the earlier in the process, oftentimes the more compelling business case you'll be able to build. So at a high level, finance, IT, HR, payroll are core participants within the process. And then of course, anyone on the Topia side is more than willing to support and help as we spend quite a bit of our time helping build these business cases. We love sharing examples and learnings with organizations that could use a little bit of help.
Great, thanks, Steve. Another question that's come in is, how quickly does a technology investment typically pay off?
Yeah, so that can vary quite widely depending on the organization. I've seen it as fast as 3 to 4 months from when the investment in technology was actually then started saving money, just given how much was being spent with outsourced manual providers. Typically, on average, I would say within its first year, it's break even, and that makes a pretty compelling case for finance at that point.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And the final question we have before wrapping today is around employee experience. So how do you prove that mobility technology is actually going to improve engagement?
That's a great one, and we could probably spend an entire webinar on that one. I think there are a couple of key data points that are pretty easy to get. I mentioned one earlier in the conversation today around retention data. So most organizations, and maybe it requires a little bit of manual cleaning, you can very easily see average employee retention across the business, and then what does that look like for the subset of employees that have had mobility experiences. So that's the place I would start because you can typically start to show that move of the needle. I think the other thing is, talk to any potential provider around data that they can share and help provide around employee experience, employee satisfaction, things like Net Promoter Score as well. I would certainly expect any technology solution to be able to bring some data to the conversation as well in support of that business case. So just a couple of ideas there to get folks started, but everyone should be able to see my email on the screen, just steve@topia.com, and more than happy to have a quick chat, bounce around some ideas, or help however we can as you think about building a case for change.
Great, thanks, Steve. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and wrap up our webinar here, and thank you again, Steve, for putting together this presentation. As Steve mentioned, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to him at steve@topia.com. And you can find more on our upcoming events and webinars at topia.com/events. We've got another webinar happening on November 15th we're really excited about, and you can find more details online. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you again soon.